They said I would never have the courage to do what I did last Thursday. The Western media called me another African dictator making empty threats. Israeli intelligence dismissed me as a young soldier playing politics. Even some of my own advisors whispered I was moving too fast, too hard, too dangerously. They were all wrong, because while they were busy underestimating me, I was busy dismantling their entire shadow network across my continent. And what I'm about to tell you isn't just what happened in Burkina Faso. It's the blueprint for how Africa finally stops being the world's playground. My name is Ibrahim Traore, and this is the story of how I declared war on Benjamin Netanyahu's African empire. Let me start with something they don't want you to know. For the past 15 years, while African leaders were signing development deals and shaking hands for photo ops, Netanyahu was building something else entirely. A spider web of intelligence operations, data harvesting companies, and surveillance networks that stretched from Lagos to Nairobi. They thought we were too poor to notice, too desperate to say no, too divided to fight back. I noticed everything. Do you want to know what really triggered last Thursday's operation? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief walked into my office with a folder. Inside were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite imagery that made my blood run cold. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecommunications, tracking the movement of our citizens through facial recognition systems we never agreed to install. But here's the part that made me realize we were past the point of diplomacy. They were sharing this intelligence with multinational corporations to help them extract better deals from African governments. Our own data was being used to exploit us more efficiently. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my office until dawn, and I made a decision that would change everything. I called my military commanders at 5 in the morning. Operation Clear Sight begins in 2 hours, I told them. No leaks, no delays, no mercy. At exactly 7 a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was still waking up, my forces moved simultaneously on 17 different targets across the city. The first location was a telecommunications company on the eastern edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any other office building. Clean glass windows, corporate logo, employees arriving for another normal day at work, except nothing about this company was normal. My soldiers entered without announcing themselves. What they found inside made international headlines within hours, though most media outlets refused to report the full story. Rooms filled with server equipment powerful enough to monitor the communications of half the continent. Hard drives containing personal data of over 2 million Burkinabe citizens. Encrypted phones with direct lines to Tel Aviv intelligence offices. And documents, thousands of documents, detailing how our national security was being systematically compromised. But that was just the beginning. By 9 a.m., we had raided 6 more Israeli-linked operations. Not just businesses, understand. These were sophisticated intelligence gathering posts disguised as development organizations, technology companies, and humanitarian groups. At each location, the same pattern emerged. Equipment designed for mass surveillance, data belonging to African citizens being prepared for transfer to foreign servers, communication systems that bypassed our national security protocols entirely. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew evidence alone wouldn't be enough. The world needed to see action. At noon, I walked in front of the cameras, and I said something that I had been preparing to say for months. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects, and we are definitely no longer your blind spot. Those words weren't just meant for my people. They were a direct message to Benjamin Netanyahu, who at that very moment was probably receiving frantic calls from his African operations team. Within 6 hours of my announcement, something unprecedented began to happen across West Africa. Mali's president called me personally. "Ibrahim," he said, "we found similar operations in Bamako. What do we do?" "Shut them down," I told him. "All of them. Guinea's military leadership reached out through encrypted channels. They had been monitoring suspicious Israeli activities for months, but hadn't known how to act without creating diplomatic incidents. I gave them permission to stop worrying about diplomatic incidents. By Thursday evening, 3 neighboring countries had frozen Israeli military technology imports. 4 more were conducting emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure projects, and the African Union was privately discussing something that had never been attempted before: a continental strategy for countering foreign intelligence infiltration. But here's what really scared Netanyahu's government. This wasn't just about Israel anymore. The evidence we uncovered revealed cooperation between Israeli operations and intelligence services from France, Britain, and the United States. Our own telecommunications infrastructure had been compromised not by one foreign power, but by an entire network of them. For decades, they had been sharing intelligence about Africa like we were a commodity to be divided among themselves. That realization changed everything for me. I realized that what we were fighting wasn't just Israeli overreach. We were fighting a colonial mindset that never really ended. It just learned to use technology instead of gunboats. The morning after our operations, I received a call from an Israeli diplomat demanding to know on what authority I had acted. I told him exactly what authority I acted on: the authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on by foreign powers. But the conversation that really mattered happened 2 days later. Netanyahu himself requested a private phone call with me through diplomatic channels. "President Traoré," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about our activities in your region." "Mr. Netanyahu," I replied, "the only misunderstanding was thinking we wouldn't notice." He tried to explain that Israeli companies were contributing to African development, creating jobs, building infrastructure. I interrupted him. "Mr. Netanyahu, when you build infrastructure that spies on the people it's supposed to serve, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing." The call ended after 12 minutes. Netanyahu never called back, but his government's response was swift and predictable. Israeli media began reporting that I was destabilizing the region and threatening democratic partnerships. European newspapers published opinion pieces questioning my authoritarian tendencies. The same newspapers, I should mention, that had never written a single article questioning why foreign intelligence operations were legal in African countries in the first place. Their propaganda campaign might have worked 5 years ago, but something has changed across this continent, and they're too arrogant to see it. Young Africans don't get their news from European newspapers anymore. They see through the language of partnership and cooperation when it's used to justify surveillance and exploitation. The evening our operations concluded, thousands of people gathered outside the presidential compound, not to protest my actions, but to celebrate them. Young people held signs reading, "Our data, our choice, and Africa is not for sale." University students organized teach-ins about digital sovereignty. Even my critics admitted that what we had exposed needed to be exposed. But the most important support came from somewhere unexpected. African leaders who had been quietly frustrated with foreign interference for years began reaching out privately. Presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders from across the continent started sharing their own intelligence about suspicious foreign activities. What emerged was a picture of systematic surveillance and data extraction that went far beyond what any single country could address alone. That's when I realized we needed something that had never existed before: an African intelligence doctrine designed by Africans for Africans. Over the following weeks, I worked with leaders from 6 West African nations to draft what we're calling the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. The principles are simple but revolutionary: complete transparency for all foreign investments in telecommunications and data infrastructure. Any company wanting to operate in our countries must submit to full audits by African-controlled oversight bodies. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities. Foreign operations that cannot clearly demonstrate their civilian purpose will be immediately terminated. Continental cooperation in monitoring and responding to foreign interference. What affects one African country affects all of us. And here's the principle that has Western governments most concerned. African data stays in Africa unless African governments explicitly agree otherwise. The framework isn't just about protecting ourselves from surveillance. It's about recognizing that information is power, and African information should serve African interests first. Netanyahu's government tried to dismiss our framework as unrealistic and economically damaging. They warned that African countries couldn't survive without Israeli technology and expertise. They were wrong about that too. Within 3 weeks of implementing our new digital sovereignty protocols, we had received partnership offers from China, Russia, India, and even some European companies willing to operate under transparent conditions. Turns out the world has plenty of technology partners who don't need to spy on their customers to do business. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. American intelligence officials, in private conversations with African diplomats, admitted they were reassessing some of their own data collection practices in Africa. Not because they wanted to, but because our framework was inspiring similar initiatives across the global South. When one continent starts demanding digital sovereignty, it becomes much harder to deny it to others. The ripple effects have exceeded even my expectations. Morocco announced new restrictions on foreign data collection. Kenya launched an audit of all international telecommunications partnerships. Nigeria began requiring foreign tech companies to store citizen data within national borders. Even South Africa, usually cautious about challenging Western partners, declared that African digital infrastructure should primarily serve African interests. For the first time in decades, African countries are setting the terms of technological engagement instead of simply accepting whatever terms are offered. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't anti-Western sentiment or anti-Israeli prejudice. This is pro-African pragmatism. We welcome partnership with any country that respects our sovereignty and operates transparently. We reject any relationship based on deception, surveillance, or the assumption that African consent is optional. Netanyahu's government could have chosen transparency from the beginning. They could have asked permission instead of assuming forgiveness. They could have treated African nations as equals instead of intelligence targets. They chose otherwise, and they're experiencing the consequences of that choice. The most interesting development has been watching how other world powers are adapting to our new approach. Chinese companies, despite their own reputation for digital authoritarianism, have been surprisingly willing to submit to our transparency requirements. Russian partners have agreed to full audit processes without complaint. Even some European companies have started marketing themselves as African digital sovereignty compliant to distinguish themselves from competitors who refuse to operate transparently. The market is rewarding transparency and punishing surveillance capitalism, exactly as we hoped it would. Meanwhile, Israeli companies that once operated freely across Africa are finding themselves locked out of an increasing number of markets, not because of political hostility, but because they refuse to meet the transparency standards that are becoming continental norms. Netanyahu's African strategy assumed that African leaders would always prioritize short-term economic benefits over long-term sovereignty concerns. That assumption is proving costly, but perhaps the most significant change isn't in government policies or corporate practices. It's in how young Africans think about their relationship with the world. University students across the continent are studying our digital sovereignty framework. They're organizing conferences about technological independence. They're demanding that their governments adopt similar protections. A generation of Africans is growing up with the expectation that their data, their communications, and their digital infrastructure should serve their interests first. That expectation will shape the continent's relationship with the world for decades to come. 6 months after Operation Clearsight, I can report that Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is more secure, more transparent, and more beneficial to our people than it has ever been. Our internet speeds have actually improved since we terminated compromised partnerships and replaced them with transparent alternatives. Our telecommunications costs have decreased. Our data sovereignty has been restored. Most importantly, our citizens know that their government is protecting their digital rights instead of trading them away for foreign investment. The lesson for other African leaders is simple. Technological independence isn't just possible, it's profitable. But the lesson for foreign powers is equally clear. The era of assuming African consent is over. We are no longer the continent that says yes to everything out of desperation. We are no longer the market that accepts any terms because we believe we have no alternatives. We are the continent that evaluates partnerships based on mutual benefit and mutual respect. And if you can't meet those standards, there are plenty of other partners who can. The choice, as always, is yours. But understand that our choice has already been made. We choose sovereignty. We choose transparency. We choose an Africa that controls its own digital destiny. Everything else is negotiable. Benjamin Netanyahu learned this lesson the hard way. He won't be the last world leader who has to learn it. The question isn't whether other countries will respect African digital sovereignty. The question is how much it will cost them to learn the same lesson Netanyahu learned. Because one way or another, they will learn it. The age of African digital colonialism is ending. What comes next depends entirely on how quickly the rest of the world adapts to that reality. This is Ibrahim Traore, and this is how we reclaimed our digital independence. The revolution will not be surveilled.